At my husband's funeral, his lover laughed, then the lawyer said my name. The sound cut through the September morning like glass breaking in a cathedral. I stood there, black dress clinging to my trembling frame, watching this woman, this stranger, who knew my husband's body better than I did in our final years, throw her head back in genuine amusement at something the pastor had just said about David's devotion to family. Her name was Miranda. I'd learned that 3 days ago when the hospital called to say she'd been listed as his emergency contact. Not me, her. David always said you had no sense of humor, she whispered to me as mourners filed past the casket, their eyes carefully avoiding both of us. I can see why he needed someone who could laugh. I said nothing. What was there to say? That I'd lost my sense of humor somewhere between the second mortgage and the third miscarriage. That laughter had died in me the same year David stopped coming home for dinner, stopped asking about my day, stopped pretending our marriage was anything more than a legal arrangement. The funeral home was packed with faces I recognized, but didn't really know. David's colleagues from the investment firm, neighbors who'd watched our marriage crumble from behind their curtains, distant relatives who'd driven in for the spectacle. They all knew about Miranda, of course. In a town this size, secrets lasted about as long as morning frost. He was a good man, Mrs. Henderson from next door murmured as she passed, her eyes darting between Miranda and me like she was watching a tennis match. Such a tragedy. A good man. The phrase followed me through the service, like a haunting. David had been many things, charming, successful, devastatingly handsome, even but good. That was a word that had lost its meaning somewhere in the ruins of our 23-year marriage. I watched Miranda during the eulogy, the way she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that never quite touched her makeup, the way she nodded knowingly when the pastor spoke of David's passion for life. She was younger than me, of course 38 to my 45, with the kind of effortless beauty that comes from never having to choose between groceries and the electric bill, never having to explain why you can't afford the fertility treatments that might save your marriage. David was a man who lived fully, the pastor continued, his voice echoing in the too quiet space. He embraced every opportunity, every relationship, every moment with enthusiasm. Miranda's laugh bubbled up again, softer this time, but still audible. I felt the collective intake of breath from the congregation, the delicious scandal of it all. Here was the grieving widow, stoic and proper in her black suit from 3 seasons ago. And here was the mistress, radiant in her grief, unashamed of her place in this tragedy. But then something unexpected happened. As the service concluded and people began to file out, a man in an expensive suit approached me. He was tall, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that commanded attention even in a room full of mourners. Mrs. Hartwell, his voice was gentle but professional. I'm James Morrison, your husband's attorney. I wonder if I might have a word with you. I glanced around, noting that Miranda had positioned herself near the exit, accepting condolences like a receiving line of one. Of course. Perhaps we could speak privately. There are some matters regarding David's estate that require immediate attention. Estate, the word felt foreign on my tongue. David and I had lived paycheck to paycheck for years, despite his impressive salary. There had always been another investment opportunity, another business venture, another reason why we couldn't quite get ahead. I'd assumed there would be nothing left but debt and the mortgage on our modest colonial. I don't understand, I said, following him to a quiet corner of the funeral home. David never mentioned having a will. Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Mrs. Hartwell, your husband, had quite extensive estate planning documents. In fact, he updated his will just 6 months ago. 6 months ago, right around the time he'd started working late every night. Right around the time he'd stopped bothering to hide the receipts from expensive restaurants I'd never been to. I see, I said, though I didn't see anything at all. The reading is scheduled for tomorrow at 2 o'clock. I trust you'll be able to attend. Yes, but I glanced toward Miranda, who was now embracing David's business partner, with theatrical grief. Will there be others there? Morrison followed my gaze, and his expression grew carefully neutral. All beneficiaries will be notified. Of course, beneficiaries, plural. The word hit me like a physical blow. Of course David had left something to Miranda. Of course his final act would be to humiliate me one last time, to make sure that even in death, I would be reminded of my inadequacy, my failure to keep him happy, my inability to be enough. Mrs. Hartwell. Morrison's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? I realized I'd been staring at Miranda, watching her accept sympathy and support from people who should have been comforting me. She caught my eye across the room and had the audacity to smile. Not cruel, exactly, but knowing, the smile of a woman who had won something I hadn't even realized we were competing for. I'm fine, I lied, the same lie I'd been telling for years. Tomorrow at 2 I'll be there. As Morrison walked away, I found myself alone in the corner of the funeral home, watching my husband's mourners disperse into the bright September afternoon. Some stopped to speak with Miranda, others nodded politely in my direction, but most simply left, eager to escape the awkwardness of a funeral where the wife and mistress had shared the same space. I should have felt angry. I should have felt betrayed or devastated or any of the emotions that a wronged wife was supposed to feel. Instead, I felt nothing but a strange, hollow curiosity about what David had planned for his final performance. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? One last show, one last opportunity to prove that even in death, he could surprise me, could find new ways to make me feel small and insignificant. The funeral director approached with practiced sympathy. Mrs. Hartwell, if you're ready, we can proceed to the cemetery now. I nodded, gathering my purse and the single white rose I'd brought, not because I loved David, but because it seemed like something a widow should do. As I walked toward the exit, I passed the guest book where people had signed their names and written brief condolences. He was lucky to have you, someone had written, a devoted husband and friend. Read another, he'll be missed by all who knew him. Lies, all of it. Pretty lies that people told themselves to make sense of senseless things, to find meaning in the meaningless. David hadn't been lucky to have me. He'd been bored by me. He hadn't been devoted. He'd been distracted. And he wouldn't be missed by all who knew him, because the people who really knew him were too few and too complicit to grieve honestly. But tomorrow, at 2 o'clock, I would learn what David's version of honesty looked like. I would sit in a lawyer's office and discover what my 23 years of marriage had been worth in his final accounting. As I stepped into the bright September sun, I caught sight of Miranda getting into a red BMW I'd never seen before. She waved at me through the window, actually waved as if we were friends, as if we'd just shared a pleasant afternoon instead of burying the man who had connected and divided us. I didn't wave back. I simply stood there, watching her drive away, wondering what tomorrow would bring and whether I was strong enough to face whatever new humiliation David had planned for me from beyond the grave. The cemetery was only 10 minutes away, but it felt like a journey to another world entirely. The cemetery was smaller than I'd expected. A quiet patch of green tucked between two residential neighborhoods where David would spend eternity, surrounded by the kind of suburban normalcy he'd spent his life trying to escape. The graveside service was mercifully brief. A few more words about David's zest for life, a prayer I didn't listen to, the mechanical lowering of the casket into earth that looked too neat, too orderly for something as messy as death. Miranda stood across from me during the burial, her red dress a splash of defiance against the sea of black sheet. Brought a bouquet of yellow roses, David's favorite, though I'd never known that in all our years together. The realization hit me like a small, sharp blade. This woman knew things about my husband that I didn't. She knew his preferences, his secrets, perhaps even his dreams. After the last shovelful of dirt was thrown and the crowd began to disperse, I found myself alone at the graveside. The headstone wouldn't be ready for weeks, so there was only a small metal marker with David's name and dates. David Michael Hartwell, 1971 to 2023. 52 years reduced to a dash between numbers. Quite a turnout, a voice said behind me. I turned to find Miranda approaching, her heels sinking slightly into the soft ground. Up close, she was even more beautiful than I'd realized, the kind of natural elegance that made my own careful grooming look effortful and desperate. "Yes," I said, because what else was there to say? "I wanted to talk to you," she said, stopping a few feet away. "Before tomorrow, the will reading. James Morrison called me this morning." She studied my face carefully. "You didn't know I'd be there, did you?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice. Miranda sighed, looking suddenly older, more tired. "David never told you about the will." "David never told me about a lot of things, apparently." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but Miranda didn't flinch. Instead, she nodded as if she'd expected my bitterness. "He loved you, you know," she said quietly. The statement was so unexpected, so absurd, that I almost laughed. Almost. He had a strange way of showing it. He did. "Love you. Miranda sat down on a nearby bench, her perfect posture wilting slightly. "He talked about you all the time, about how you used to be, before everything got so complicated." "Before you mean?" "Before a lot of things." She looked at me directly, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't expected. Sadness. Real, genuine sadness. Before the miscarriages, before the money problems, before he started feeling like he was failing at everything that mattered. The mention of the miscarriages hit me like a physical blow. David and I had never talked about them, not really. After the third one, we'd simply stopped trying, stopped hoping, stopped acknowledging the growing silence between us where our children should have been. He told you about that. He told me about everything. That was the problem, wasn't it? He couldn't talk to you anymore, couldn't figure out how to bridge the gap that had grown between you. So he talked to me instead. I stared at this woman who had stolen my husband's confidences along with his body, trying to understand what she was telling me, and that makes it better somehow. "No," Miranda said simply. "It makes it worse. Because I knew he was married, knew he was hurting you, and I let it happen anyway. I told myself it was different, that what we had was separate from what you two had. But it wasn't separate, was it? It was connected to everything. The honesty of it was more devastating than any cruelty could have been." I found myself sitting down on the bench beside her, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me up. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because tomorrow is going to be difficult," Miranda said. "And because I think you deserve to know that David's feelings for you were complicated, but they were real. He never stopped loving you, Catherine. He just stopped knowing how to show it. Catherine." She used my name like she knew me, like we were friends having a difficult conversation, instead of two women whose lives had been destroyed by the same man. "How long?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. 2 years? 2 years? I thought back, trying to pinpoint when David had started staying late at the office. When he'd begun taking business trips that seemed to have no clear purpose. When he'd stopped touching me casually, a hand on my shoulder, a kiss goodbye. The small intimacies that had once been automatic. Was it serious? Miranda was quiet for a long moment. He asked me to marry him. The words hung in the air between us like a curse. David had asked this woman to marry him while he was still married to me, while I was still waiting for him to come home each night, still setting to places at the dinner table, still pretending our marriage was something that could be saved. When? Last month. The night before he had the heart attack. I closed my eyes, trying to process this information. David had proposed to another woman and died the next day, leaving both of us widowed in different ways. What did you tell him? I told him he needed to talk to you first, that I wouldn't marry him while he was still married to someone else. No matter how unhappy that marriage was, Miranda's voice was barely above a whisper. I told him he owed you honesty, at the very least. And what did he say? He said he would. He said he'd been planning to ask for a divorce for months, but couldn't figure out how to do it without destroying you completely. She looked at me with something that might have been pity. He said, "You'd been through enough." The irony was breathtaking. David had been protecting me from the truth of his infidelity by continuing to live a lie, by coming home each night and pretending to be a husband while planning his escape. His kindness had been its own form of cruelty. So he never got the chance to ask for the divorce. No. He died thinking he was going to have to choose between hurting you and losing me. Miranda stood up, smoothing her dress. I guess in the end, he found a way to avoid making that choice. I looked up at her. This woman who had loved my husband enough to demand honesty from him, who had refused to marry him while he was still married to me. She was more honorable than either David or I had been. I for staying in a marriage that was already dead. He for refusing to end it cleanly. Miranda, I said as she turned to leave. Yes, tomorrow, at the lawyer's office. What do you think he left you? She smiled sadly. I don't know, but I suspect it's going to surprise both of us. After she left, I sat alone at David's graveside as the afternoon shadows grew longer. The cemetery was quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic and the occasional bird. I thought about the woman I'd just spoken with, the woman who had known my husband's dreams and fears better than I had. I thought about the marriage I'd been clinging to, the life I'd been living that was built on assumptions and silences, and the careful avoidance of difficult truths. For 23 years, I had been David's wife, but for the last 2 years, I had been his widow in everything but name. Mourning a marriage that had already died, grieving a man who had already left me, even though he still came home each night. Tomorrow, I would learn what David had really thought of our life together. Tomorrow, I would discover what 23 years of marriage was worth in his final accounting. But tonight, sitting in the gathering dusk beside his grave, I realized that I already knew the answer. Our marriage had been worth exactly what it had been for the past 2 years, a beautiful lie. Carefully maintained, lovingly preserved, and ultimately meaningless. The question now was what I was going to do with the truth. As I finally stood to leave, I placed my white rose on the fresh earth over David's grave, not because I loved him, but because I had loved him once, and that love, however flawed, however incomplete, deserved to be acknowledged. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new complications, new reasons to question everything I thought I knew about my life. But tonight, I would go home to the house David and I had shared, and I would begin the process of figuring out who Catherine Hartwell was when she wasn't being David's wife. It was a question I should have asked myself years ago. Morrison's law office occupied the 3rd floor of a restored Victorian building downtown. All dark wood and leather-bound books that spoke of old money and older secrets. I arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, my hands steady despite the sleepless night I'd spent, wondering what fresh humiliation awaited me. Miranda was already there, seated in one of the burgundy leather chairs facing Morrison's massive desk. She'd chosen a simple black dress today, more appropriate for a widow than the red she'd worn to the burial. She nodded when I entered, a small acknowledgement that felt both intimate and strange. Mrs. Hartwell, Morrison said, rising from behind his desk. Thank you for coming. Please have a seat. I took the chair beside Miranda, close enough to smell her perfume, something expensive and floral that David must have bought for her. The thought should have stung, but I found myself oddly detached, as if I were watching this scene unfold from a great distance. Before we begin, Morrison said, settling back into his chair, I want to explain that David's will is ... unusual. He spent considerable time crafting it, and he left specific instructions about how it should be presented. He opened a thick folder and withdrew several documents, arranging them carefully on the desk between us. David requested that I read certain portions aloud, in his own words. He felt it was important that both of you understand not just what he was leaving you, but why. Miranda and I exchanged glances. This was already more complicated than either of us had expected. Shall we begin? Morrison asked, though it wasn't really a question. He picked up the first document and cleared his throat. To my wife, Catherine Marie Hartwell, who gave me 23 years of her life and deserved far better than I was able to give her in return. The words hit me like a physical blow. David's voice, speaking from beyond the grave, acknowledging what we had both known but never said aloud. Catherine, by the time you hear this, you will know about Miranda. You will know that I failed you in the most fundamental way a husband can fail his wife. I cannot ask for your forgiveness because I don't deserve it. But I can try to explain, and I can try to make amends." Morrison paused, glancing at both of us. Miranda was staring at her hands, her face pale. I felt frozen, suspended between curiosity and dread. "Our marriage died slowly, Catherine. Not from any single wound, but from 1,000 small cuts, the children we couldn't have, the dreams we couldn't afford, the conversations we stopped having because they hurt too much. We became strangers, living in the same house, polite and careful and utterly alone. The accuracy of it was devastating. David had seen our marriage with the same clarity I had felt the same slow suffocation, the same gradual erosion of everything that had once connected us. I know you blame yourself for some of this. I know you think you weren't enough, weren't interesting enough, weren't woman enough to keep me happy. That is the cruelest lie I ever allowed you to believe. The failure was mine, Catherine, mine alone." I felt tears starting, the first real tears I'd shed since David's death. Not tears of grief, exactly, but tears of recognition. Of finally being seen and understood by the man who had shared my life for more than 2 decades. Morrison continued reading. "I met Miranda 2 years ago at a conference in Chicago. She was everything you weren't, young, unencumbered, full of laughter and possibility. I told myself that what I felt for her was separate from what I felt for you, that I could love her without it diminishing my love for you. I was wrong." Miranda made a small sound, something between a sob and a sigh. I reached over without thinking and took her hand. She squeezed back, and we sat there holding hands while my dead husband's words washed over us. Miranda made me remember who I used to be before life wore me down, before disappointment became my default setting. With her, I could pretend I was still the man who married you with such hope, such certainty that we could build something beautiful together. But pretending isn't living, and lying isn't loving. Morrison set down the first page and picked up another. "There's more, but perhaps I should explain the practical matters first. David's estate is more substantial than either of you might expect." He pulled out a financial statement that made my breath catch. David had been worth nearly $2 million. Investments, life insurance policies, accounts I'd never known existed. "How is that possible?" I asked. "We were always struggling financially. David maintained separate accounts for several years," Morrison explained gently. "He was quite successful with his investments, but he kept that success hidden. Like everything else in our marriage, the house is paid off," Morrison continued. "Has been for 3 years. David also owned a small apartment building downtown, an investment property that's been generating substantial rental income." I stared at the numbers, trying to process this information. While I had been clipping coupons and worrying about the mortgage, David had been building wealth in secret. While I had been feeling like a failure for not contributing more financially, he had been hiding his success from me. "Why?" I whispered. Morrison consulted the will again. "I kept our financial success from Catherine because I was afraid she would see it as permission to leave me, as long as she thought we needed her income, as long as she believed we were struggling together. I could pretend our marriage was a partnership instead of a prison. The honesty of it was brutal. David had trapped me with artificial poverty, had kept me dependent and worried while he built a fortune I knew nothing about. I know how this sounds, Catherine. I know it seems cruel and manipulative, and perhaps it was, but I was terrified of losing you, even though I had already lost you in every way that mattered. I was terrified of being alone, even though I had made us both desperately lonely." Miranda spoke for the first time since we'd sat down. "What about the division of assets?" Morrison turned to a new page. "David left specific instructions about that as well." He began reading again, "To Miranda Chen, who loved me without conditions and deserved a man who could love her the same way. I leave you the apartment building and all rental income, along with $500,000 in liquid assets. This is not payment for your affection, which was freely given and deeply treasured. This is my attempt to give you the security and independence you need to build a life without me." Miranda's hand tightened in mine. $500,000 plus a rental property, enough to ensure she would never have to depend on anyone again. Miranda, I need you to understand that my feelings for you were real, but they were also selfish. I used your love to escape from problems I should have faced, to avoid conversations I should have had, to postpone decisions I should have made years ago. You deserved better than a man who could only love you in secret, who could only be honest with you in the shadows. Morrison looked at me. The remainder of the estate, approximately $1.2 million, plus the house and all its contents, goes to Catherine. I sat in stunned silence. David had left me wealthy, financially independent, free from the money worries that had plagued our entire marriage. But he had also left me with the knowledge that our financial struggles had been an elaborate fiction, a way to control me through manufactured scarcity. There's one final section, Morrison said, addressed to both of you. Catherine and Miranda, I know this situation is impossible for both of you. I know that my death has left you both widowed in different ways, both grieving for different versions of the same flawed man. I hope that someday you might find it possible to forgive me, but I don't expect it. I hope that you might find it possible to understand each other, to see that you were both victims of my cowardice and selfishness. Morrison set down the papers and looked at us both. There are some additional documents, insurance policies, property deeds, investment accounts, but that's the substance of David's will. We sat in silence for several minutes, processing what we'd heard. David had given us both financial security, but he had also given us something more complicated. The truth about who he really was, about what our relationships with him had really meant. Mrs. Hartwell Morrison said gently, there's one more thing. David left this for you personally. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in David's familiar handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few lines. Catherine, I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I'm going to ask anyway. Please don't let my failures define the rest of your life. You are stronger, kinder, and more capable than I ever gave you credit for. You deserve happiness, real happiness, not the careful compromise we settled for. Use this money to build the life you should have had all along. Travel, take risks, fall in love with someone who will love you the way you deserve to be loved. I'm sorry for all of it. I'm sorry for the time I wasted, the opportunities I stole from you, the woman I prevented you from becoming. But mostly, I'm sorry that it took my death to give you your freedom. David I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Around me, Morrison was explaining practical matters, probate procedures, tax implications, timelines for transferring assets. But I was thinking about the woman David had described in his letter. The woman I might have been if I hadn't spent 23 years trying to save a marriage that was already dead. For the first time since David's death, I felt something that might have been hope. Miranda and I walked out of Morrison's office together, two women bound by the strange intimacy of shared betrayal. The afternoon sun felt too bright after the dim solemnity of the law office, and I found myself squinting against the light as if emerging from a cave. Coffee? Miranda asked as we reached the sidewalk. I think we both need to process what just happened. I nodded, not trusting my voice. We walked in silence to a small cafe 2 blocks away. The kind of place David would have dismissed as too bohemian, too unpretentious for his carefully cultivated image. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was having coffee with his mistress in exactly the sort of place he would have avoided. We found a quiet table in the back corner, away from the afternoon crowd of students and freelancers. Miranda ordered a latte. I asked for black coffee, suddenly craving something bitter and unadorned. $2 million, Miranda said finally, stirring sugar into her drink. Did you have any idea? None. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, seeking warmth. I balanced our checkbook every month. I knew exactly how much we had, down to the penny. Or I thought I did. He was protecting you, Miranda said, but her voice lacked conviction. He was controlling me. The words came out sharper than I'd intended. There's a difference. Miranda nodded slowly. You're right. I'm sorry. I keep trying to make excuses for him, even now. She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her latte as if it might contain answers. Because if I admit that he was manipulative and controlling with you, I have to admit that he might have been manipulative with me too, and I'm not ready for that yet. The honesty of her admission surprised me. I'd expected defensiveness, justification, perhaps even cruelty. Instead, I found myself sitting across from a woman who was questioning everything she thought she knew about the man we'd both loved. "Tell me about him," I said. "The David you knew. I want to understand." Miranda looked up, searching my face for signs of a trap. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." She took a deep breath. "He was ... lighter with me. Younger, somehow. He laughed more, worried less. He talked about dreams instead of problems, possibilities instead of limitations." "What kind of dreams?" "Traveling. He wanted to see Italy, to drive through Tuscany and eat at little family restaurants where they didn't speak English. He wanted to learn to sail, to buy a boat, and spend weekends on the water." Miranda's voice grew softer. "He wanted children." The last words hit me like a physical blow. Children. He said it was his biggest regret, not having kids. He said you two had tried but it didn't work out, and that he'd accepted it but never gotten over it. I stared at her, feeling the careful narrative of my marriage shifting again. "We stopped trying after the third miscarriage. David said he was fine with it being just the two of us. He wasn't fine with it, he grieved those babies. Catherine, he grieved the family you couldn't have together." The revelation was devastating in its implications. David had spent years pretending to be content with our childless marriage, while secretly mourning the children we'd lost. He'd hidden his grief from me, had carried it alone, had let it fester until it became another wall between us. Why didn't he tell me? Because he thought you blamed yourself enough already. He said you carried guilt about the miscarriages that wasn't yours to carry, and he didn't want to add to it. I thought about all the years I'd spent feeling like a failure as a woman, unable to give my husband the family he deserved. I thought about the careful way David had avoided the topic of children, the way he'd changed the subject whenever friends announced pregnancies, the way he'd grown quiet around families with young children. "So he told you instead?" "Yes." And I listened, and I understood, and I made him feel like his grief was valid. Miranda's voice was barely above a whisper. "I gave him something you couldn't give him permission to mourn." The truth of it was almost unbearable. I had been so focused on my own guilt and shame that I'd never considered David might be grieving too. I'd assumed his silence meant acceptance, when it actually meant he felt he couldn't share his pain with the person who should have been sharing it. "We were both grieving," I said slowly, "but we were doing it alone." "Yes, and that grief, it poisoned everything else. It made you both careful with each other, afraid to want too much, afraid to hope for anything that might be taken away." I sipped my coffee, trying to process this new understanding of my marriage. David and I hadn't just grown apart, we'd been driven apart by unshared grief, by the weight of losses we'd carried separately instead of together. "Is that why you fell in love with him? Because he could grieve with you?" Miranda shook her head. "I fell in love with him because he was charming and intelligent and made me feel like the most interesting woman in the world. The grief came later, when he started trusting me with the parts of himself he couldn't show you." "And when did you realize he was never going to leave me?" The question hung between us, honest and brutal. Miranda's face crumpled slightly, and I saw the pain she'd been hiding behind her composed exterior. "About 6 months ago, when he started talking about asking me to marry him but kept finding reasons to postpone the conversation with you. When he started making plans for our future but couldn't bring himself to end his past. But you stayed with him anyway." "I stayed because I loved him, and because I thought maybe if I was patient enough, understanding enough, he'd find the courage to choose me." She laughed bitterly. "I was as trapped as you were, Catherine. Just in a different way." We sat in silence for several minutes. Two women who had loved the same man and been disappointed by him in different but equally profound ways. The cafe buzzed with conversation around us, but our corner felt isolated, suspended in its own pocket of revelation and regret. "What are you going to do now?" I asked finally. "I don't know." David's money gives me options I never had before, but it also feels like blood money, like payment for services rendered. Miranda's voice was bitter. What about you? I thought about David's letter, his instruction to build the life I should have had all along. I think I'm going to sell the house. Really, it's full of ghosts. 23 years of careful silences and polite lies. I can't build a new life in a place that's so saturated with the old one. Miranda nodded. That makes sense. Where will you go? I don't know yet. Maybe nowhere. Maybe everywhere. The idea felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I've never lived alone, you know? I went from my parents' house to college to marriage. I've never had to figure out who I am when I'm not taking care of someone else. That sounds lonely. It sounds free. We finished our coffee in comfortable silence, and when it was time to leave, Miranda reached across the table and took my hand. Catherine, I need you to know something. I never meant to hurt you. I knew about you, knew David was married, but I told myself it didn't matter because your marriage was already over. I was wrong to think that, wrong to justify it that way. I know, I said, and realized I meant it. I'm not angry with you, Miranda. Not anymore. Why not? You should be. Because you loved him, honestly. You gave him what he asked for, what he needed. The fact that he was asking for it from the wrong person, that's not your fault. Miranda's eyes filled with tears. He should have been able to get that from you. You should have been able to grieve together, to heal together, to build something new together. Yes, I agreed. We should have. But we didn't know how, and he didn't have the courage to learn. As we parted ways outside the cafe, Miranda hugged me, a real hug, not the polite embrace of acquaintances, but the desperate hold of two people who had survived the same storm. Will I see you again? She asked. I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe. When we've both figured out who we are without him. I watched her walk away. This woman who had known my husband's dreams better than I had, who had given him permission to grieve in ways I never could. She wasn't my enemy, I realized. She was just another casualty of David's inability to live honestly, to love completely, to choose courageously. As I drove home to the house I would soon sell, to the life I would soon leave behind, I thought about the woman David had described in his letter, the woman I might become if I had the courage to start over, to build something real instead of something safe. For the first time in 23 years, I was free to find out who that woman might be. The question was whether I was brave enough to let her emerge. 6 months later, I stood in the empty living room of the house David and I had shared, watching the moving truck pull away with the last of my belongings. The new owners would take possession tomorrow, a young couple with a baby on the way, full of the same hope David and I had carried when we'd first walked through these rooms 24 years ago. The house looked smaller without our furniture, older without our careful maintenance. But it also looked peaceful, ready for new stories, new laughter, new possibilities. I felt no sadness leaving it behind, only a quiet sense of completion. My phone buzzed with a text from Miranda, saw the moving truck. How are you feeling? We'd stayed in touch over the past 6 months, not as friends exactly, but as two women who shared a unique understanding of loss and liberation. She'd used David's money to start a nonprofit organization supporting women leaving difficult relationships. I'd used mine to buy a small apartment in the city and enroll in graduate school, something I'd dreamed of doing for years, but had never had the courage or resources to pursue. Free, I texted back. Terrifyingly, wonderfully free. Good, you deserve that. I walked through the empty rooms one last time, not looking for forgotten items, but saying goodbye to the woman I'd been in this space. The kitchen, where I'd cooked countless meals for a man who was always thinking about someone else. The bedroom where we'd slept side by side for years without really touching. The living room where we'd watched television in comfortable silence because conversation had become too dangerous, too likely to reveal the growing distance between us. In the hallway, I paused before the spot where our wedding photo had hung for 23 years. The wall was lighter there, a perfect rectangle where the sun hadn't faded the paint. David and I had looked so young in that photo, so certain that love would be enough to carry us through whatever came next. Love hadn't been enough, but it had been real, flawed and incomplete, and ultimately insufficient, but real nonetheless. I could acknowledge that now without bitterness. Could see our marriage as a chapter that had ended, rather than a failure that had defined me. My phone rang as I was locking the front door for the last time. Morrison's name appeared on the screen. "Catherine, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to let you know that the final paperwork has been processed. David's estate is officially closed. Thank you for everything. James, you made a difficult situation as easy as it could be. There's one more thing," he said. "I received a call from Miranda Chen yesterday. She wanted me to pass along a message. I waited, curious. She said to tell you that she's met someone. A man who's never been married, who wants children, who can love her in the daylight. She wanted you to know that David's gift to her wasn't just money, it was the freedom to find something real." I smiled, genuinely happy for this woman who had been as trapped by David's indecision as I had been. "That's wonderful news. She also said to tell you that she hopes you find the same thing." After I hung up, I sat in my car outside the house for a few more minutes. Watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the lawn David had meticulously maintained. A jogger passed by, then a woman walking her dog, then a family on bicycles, the ordinary rhythm of suburban life continuing without us. My new apartment was across town, a third-floor walk-up with hardwood floors and windows that faced east toward the sunrise. It was smaller than the house, simpler, but it was mine in a way the house had never been. I'd chosen every piece of furniture, every color, every detail based on what I wanted rather than what we needed or what David preferred. The graduate program in library science started in the fall. At 45, I would be older than most of my classmates. But I'd also be more focused, more certain of what I wanted to accomplish. I'd spent 23 years being David's wife. Now I would spend the next phase of my life becoming myself. As I drove toward my new home, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Miranda the week before, when she'd called to tell me about the man she was seeing. "Do you think David would be happy for us?" she'd asked. "That we're both moving on, building new lives?" I'd considered the question carefully before answering. I think David would be relieved. I think he spent so much energy trying to keep us both happy while keeping us both in the dark that he forgot happiness isn't something you can manage or control. It's something you have to choose every day with courage and honesty. "Do you think we'll ever forgive him?" "I think we already have," I'd said. Forgiveness isn't about absolving him of responsibility. It's about refusing to let his choices define the rest of our lives. Now, pulling into the parking lot of my apartment building, I realized how true those words had been. I had forgiven David not because he deserved it, but because carrying anger was too heavy a burden for the life I wanted to build. Inside my apartment, I made tea and sat by the window, watching the city come alive in the evening light. Tomorrow, I would start my new job at the university library. Next month, I would begin classes. Next year, I would graduate and start a career I'd chosen for myself, rather than one I'd fallen into by default. But tonight, I would simply sit in my own space, surrounded by my own choices, and marvel at the strange gift David had given me in death that he'd never been able to give me in life. The freedom to discover who I was when I wasn't trying to be who someone else needed me to be. My phone buzzed with one final text from Miranda. "Thank you for showing me that it's possible to start over with grace." I typed back, "Thank you for showing me that it's possible to love someone without losing yourself." As the sun set over the city, painting my small apartment in shades of gold and amber, I raised my teacup in a silent toast to David for finally telling the truth, to Miranda for finding the courage to build something real, and to myself for having the strength to begin again. At 45, I was finally free to discover what my life could be when it was truly mine. The possibilities stretched out before me like an unwritten story, full of blank pages waiting to be filled with choices I would make. Dreams I would pursue, love I would give and receive without conditions or compromises. For the first time in 23 years, I was not someone's wife, someone's disappointment, someone's carefully managed secret. I was simply Catherine, and that was enough.